December 26th, 1993. Monticello, Iowa. After she fails to show up for work, 22-year-old Cathy Jo Bohlken is found dead inside her apartment, and she has been sexually assaulted and stabbed at least 54 times. 2 years later, Travis Jamieson, a friend of Cathy's brother who was only 16 years old at the time of the crime, is charged with her murder. Even though DNA testing links Travis to a semen sample found inside Cathy's body, his defense attorneys bring up issues with the validity of the evidence at his trial. As a result, Travis wounds up being acquitted and set free, so the truth about who killed Cathy remains up for debate. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering a case which went to trial and ended in a controversial verdict: the 1993 murder of Cathy Jo Bohlken. We have now entered the month of December, and per tradition, I'm going to be spending the next few episodes covering some cases which took place on or around Christmas. This particular crime was originally suggested to me about 2 years ago by a listener named Christine, and while I had never heard of it before, I found myself being surprised by some of the things I learned after I started my research. Cathy Jo Bohlken was a divorced mother who was found murdered inside her apartment the day after Christmas 30 years ago, and the perpetrator went to the trouble of bounding her with duct tape, placing a plastic bag over her head, and sexually assaulting her before stabbing her no less than 54 times. Everyone was shocked by the sheer brutality of this crime, which is why it came as a huge surprise just over 2 years later when the killer was identified as Travis Jamieson, a friend of one of Cathy's brothers, who would have been only 16 years old when the murder took place. Travis was arrested after DNA testing linked him to a semen sample from the crime scene, so you would think this case would be pretty cut and dried, right? Well, the issue is that there was no other physical evidence, or much in the way of evidence at all, against Travis. And since this was the 1990s, the general public did not have as much of an understanding about DNA as they do today. When Travis went on trial, his defense team did a very effective job at questioning the credibility of the DNA evidence and the testing methods that were used, so the jury ultimately did not find the case against Travis to be a slam dunk and found him not guilty. Today, debate continues to rage on about whether Travis Jamieson got away with murder, or if a botched investigation caused an innocent kid to get railroaded and the real killer to get away with it. So we're going to look at both sides of this argument on today's episode, while also providing some historical context about how the perception of DNA evidence has evolved over the past 3 decades. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as we currently have over 60 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available in a regular feed. And I also just wanted to mention that if we manage to reach our goal of 500 Patreon subscribers by the end of 2023, we will provide an additional extra special bonus to all of our patrons in January. So with all that out of the way, let us now start delving into the murder of Cathy Jo Bohlken. Our story begins in 1993 in Monticello, Iowa, a small town located in Jones County which had a population of just over 3,500 at that time. Our central figure is 22-year-old Cathy Jo Bohlken, who was originally born in Cedar Rapids to parents Dean and Karen Cox, and has a total of 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Around the time she graduated high school, Cathy was involved in a relationship with Michael Bohlken, who was 9 years her senior, and she became pregnant with his child. In February of 1990, Cathy gave birth to her son, Michael Bohlken Jr., and married Michael Sr. 4 months later. Their marriage lasted just over 2 years before they divorced, but their split was described as being an amicable one, and Cathy and Michael agreed to joint custody of their son. Cathy has attended travel school in Kansas City, Missouri, and worked at a travel agency in Cedar Rapids, but she is now living in Monticello in a rented duplex apartment on South Haven Drive, alongside her roommate, Renee Ballou. At this point, Cathy is working at Caredy's convenience store, which is owned by her father, but she is also attending Kirkwood Community College in Cedar Rapids, and is planning to continue her education in the University of Iowa's nursing program. As part of their custody agreement, Cathy and Michael Sr. would alternate between having their son on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day each year, and on this particular year, Cathy had him on Christmas Eve. Since Caredy's convenience store was open 365 days per year, and Michael Jr. would be with his father, Cathy agreed to open the store on Christmas Day at 6 a.m. and work until 2:30 p.m. After her shift ended, Cathy was invited to join her family for Christmas dinner at her grandmother's house in the town of Oxford Junction, but she decided not to go because she wasn't feeling well. Later that evening, her parents spoke to her on the phone and said she could stop by their place to have some leftovers with them, but she once again said no since she was planning to go out with friends. Cathy's roommate Renee decided to go to a Christmas party being attended by a number of their friends, but even though Renee phoned Cathy at their apartment to invite her to the party, Cathy still wasn't feeling well, and she wanted to stay home and get some rest, since she was planning to open the convenience store again at 6 a.m. the following morning. But after their call ended, this would turn out to be the last time Cathy was confirmed to be alive. At around 8:30 a.m. on the morning of December the 26th, Dean Cox received a phone call at home from a regular customer of Caredy's convenience store who was asking why the store had not opened yet. Figuring that Cathy might have overslept, Dean went down to the store to open it himself, but when Cathy failed to answer the phone after repeated calls, he asked his wife to watch over things while he went to check Cathy's apartment. When Dean arrived shortly before 9:30, he noticed that Cathy's car was still parked outside, and there was a single set of footprints in the snow leading to the front door. Dean then noticed that the door was ajar, so he walked into the apartment, and was soon horrified to discover Cathy's body lying in a pool of blood on the floor of her bedroom. She had been stabbed at least 54 times all over her head and body with a knife that was believed to be at least 6 inches long. Cathy was lying face down with a plastic bag over her head, and a pillow had been used to cover her head as well. Duct tape was placed over Cathy's mouth, and her hands were also bound with it. In addition, Cathy was nude from the waist down, and an autopsy would reveal that she was sexually assaulted. Dean immediately called 911 to report what happened before he broke down crying, and was a complete emotional mess by the time police arrived at the scene. Since Renee had stayed overnight at the location where the Christmas party took place, she was not present when her roommate's murder took place. This marked the first time a homicide had taken place in Monticello in at least 20 years, so the case would be investigated by the Monticello Police Department, the Jones County Sheriff's Office, and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Other than the fact that Cathy was stabbed to death, law enforcement initially released very few details about the crime to the public in hopes that this would help weed out false confessions. For the next 3 months, there would be no leads in the investigation until Monticello Police Chief Burt Walters publicly confirmed that Cathy had been sexually assaulted and that a semen sample left behind by the perpetrator was being sent to Cellmark Diagnostics, an independent forensics laboratory in Germantown, Maryland, which specialized in DNA testing. Chief Walters said that the blood samples were being collected by 3 unnamed individuals who lived in Monticello and were considered to be the top suspects in Cathy's murder, and the DNA from their blood would be compared to DNA extracted from the semen sample. Well, 1 month later, Walters announced that none of the DNA matched, so these 3 men were cleared as suspects. Over the course of the next year and a half, blood samples would be collected from around 90 of Cathy's male relatives, friends, and acquaintances for the purposes of making a DNA comparison with the semen evidence. Believe it or not, since Chief Walters faced public criticism for the perceived lack of progress in the investigation, he even agreed to submit a sample of his own blood for the purposes of DNA testing, and he wound up being ruled out as a suspect. At one point, the authorities became desperate enough to consult with Dorothy Allison, a self-proclaimed psychic detective from New Jersey who had worked with law enforcement on a number of investigations and was once profiled on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. In fact, Allison would travel to Monticello to participate in the filming of an episode of the TV show Sightings, which profiled Cathy's murder and aired in May of 1995. Allison told Cathy's family that she believed the killer was someone who felt spurned by her, and Cathy may not have even realized her actions were affecting this person in that fashion. Based on a vision that Allison supposedly had of the crime, she worked with a sketch artist in order to create a composite of the man whom she believed was the perpetrator. I'm usually a major skeptic about this stuff, but I do have to acknowledge that the sketch did kind of look like the person who was later arrested for the crime, though he was such an average-looking young white male that it may have been nothing more than a coincidence. The investigation continued to remain at a standstill, and on January the 26th, 1996, Burt Walters was dismissed as Monticello police chief by the town mayor and replaced by acting chief Louis Sope. Walters had often been at the center of controversy, as over the course of the previous year, a pair of lawsuits were filed against him for alleged civil rights violations. But only 5 days after Walters' dismissal, there would suddenly be a major development in this case. On January the 31st, Chief Sope finally announced that an 18-year-old Monticello resident named Travis Jamieson had been arrested and charged with first-degree murder for killing Cathy. Travis was a high school dropout who would have only been 16 when the crime took place, and he was also a friend of Cathy's younger brother, Michael Cox. And to avoid confusion with Cathy's ex-husband and son, who were both named Michael, I'm going to be referring to her brother Michael as Mike from now on. The Cox family were completely shocked when Travis was charged with the murder, though he did have a history of minor brushes with the law. In fact, on August the 18th, 1995, while celebrating his 18th birthday, Travis had gotten intoxicated and was driving Dean Cox's car alongside Mike Cox and another female companion when he veered off the highway and crashed into a bridge. The 3 occupants of the vehicle received non-life-threatening injuries, and Travis was charged with drunk driving, failure to maintain control, and reckless driving, though he received a deferred judgment on the drunk driving charge. In July of that year, Travis had voluntarily submitted a sample of his blood to investigators for the purposes of DNA testing. His blood was initially sent to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation State Lab, and when the testing did not exclude him as a suspect, the sample was then sent to Cellmark Diagnostics, the aforementioned forensics laboratory in Maryland. In January, the results of their testing came back, which showed that Travis's DNA was a match to the semen sample taken from Cathy's body. When Travis was informed about the DNA results by investigators, he reportedly broke down crying and said it was a mistake, even going so far as to hold up his arm and offering to take another blood test. Even though Travis proclaimed his innocence, he was charged with Cathy's murder and held in the Jones County Jail on a $1 million bond. Weeks later, Travis appeared in Jones County District Court and officially entered a plea of not guilty. Travis would be represented by defense attorneys Jim Thomas and Mark Roberts, who believed that due to the massive publicity surrounding the case, their client would be unable to get a fair trial in Jones County. They requested a change of venue, which was granted by a district judge, so Travis's trial would take place in Lynn County District Court in Cedar Rapids. Before the trial could take place, Travis's defense team raised a lot of issues with the DNA evidence against him. For starters, they were unhappy that they would not be able to perform their own DNA testing on the semen sample, as the previous testing had completely consumed the sample, so there was nothing left. The defense also argued that the evidence had been improperly handled by the authorities before it was tested, and the methods used by Cellmark Diagnostics to perform the DNA testing were unreliable. Jim Thomas told the press, quote, "It's a terribly complex scientific theory, and it's like any scientific evidence. It's subject to fault depending on the testing done and the quality of the lab that does the work." End quote. But even though the defense filed numerous motions to have the DNA results excluded as evidence at the trial, the courts rejected this request. After numerous delays, Travis's trial finally began in Lynn County District Court on March 10, 1997, and would be prosecuted by Iowa Assistant Attorney General James Keevy. Even though Travis's DNA had matched the semen sample, there was actually no other physical evidence against him, as no fingerprints, hairs, fibers, or footprints found at the murder scene could be linked to Travis. There were also no eyewitnesses who could place Travis at Cathy's apartment on the night of the crime, and the murder weapon was never found. The defense also argued that there was no sign of a massive struggle at the apartment, even though Travis was not a particularly large guy. But due to Travis's friendship with Cathy's brother Mike, it was established that he knew the victim and had been to Cathy's apartment on previous occasions. In fact, Mike would testify about an incident at the apartment where he witnessed Travis grab a pair of Cathy's underwear, rub them against his crotch, and say, quote, "Boy, I'd like to get into these." Mike said that Travis often made remarks about wanting to have sex with Cathy, but acknowledged that Travis was not the only one of his friends to do so. When he was initially questioned by investigators, Travis had been asked if he ever had sex with Cathy, and he replied no. As a result, the defense could not mount the argument that the presence of Travis's semen in her body was the result of consensual sex and was completely unrelated to her murder. While the duct tape used to bind Cathy could not be linked to Travis, the prosecution would bring up some previous incidents in which Travis had duct taped two other people, including Mike, as a prank. Mike also made mention of a few odd exchanges with Travis following Cathy's murder, which could have been construed as signs of guilt. At one point, Mike said they were driving past a reformatory when Travis suddenly said, quote, "I will probably spend the rest of my life there." Shortly after Travis turned over a sample of his blood to the authorities, Mike claimed there was another incident where they were driving together, and Travis asked, quote, "What if the DNA comes back and it's me?" When Mike responded that this couldn't happen because the DNA belonged to the killer, Travis once again asked, quote, "No really, what if it's me?" Mike's response was, quote, "Then I would kill you," to which Travis replied, quote, "Not if I drive into that telephone pole and kill us both." Another friend of Travis's testified that when the Sightings episode aired and Dorothy Allison's composite sketch of the killer appeared on screen, Travis asked if he thought the sketch looked like him. The prosecution argued that Travis did not have an alibi during the time period when Cathy was believed to have been murdered. On Christmas night in 1993, Travis and Mike had attended a party being held by Travis's cousin Brent Klassen at a residence located about 10 miles outside of Monticello. According to Mike, after they spent the evening drinking, Travis offered to give him a ride home in his parents' pickup truck. He initially asked Travis if they could stop by Cathy's apartment in order to ask her for some more beer and called her parents to let them know he was spending the night there. Mike said he soon changed his mind because he knew Cathy had not been feeling well and he didn't want to bother her, but Travis still drove past the apartment. Mike noticed that the lights were still on and Cathy's car was parked outside, and he said that Travis dropped him off at home at 10:15 p.m. During his original statement to investigators, Travis had denied driving by Cathy's apartment, but then later said he hadn't remembered doing so because he was drunk that night. Travis claimed that after dropping off Mike, he drove back to his cousin's party before he passed out on the couch at around 1 a.m. on December the 26th, and he spent the night there. However, Travis's story seemed to be contradicted by two other witnesses who attended the party. One of them, Kimberly Davis, testified that she recalled seeing Travis leave the party at 12:30 a.m. and did not see him return before she herself left at 2 a.m. Another witness named Charity McDonald testified that there were two couches in the living room at the party and that she and 3 of her friends fell asleep on both of them at about 11 p.m. When they woke up at around 1 a.m., most everyone else who attended the party was gone, and she had no recollection of seeing Travis there, though she acknowledged that she did not check the rest of the house, so Travis could have passed out on a couch in another room. In contrast, Travis's cousin, Brett Klassen, said that he went to bed at 1:30 a.m. and remembered seeing Travis passed out on one of the couches while he was walking up the stairs. Travis's father, Paul Jamieson, would testify that his son returned home later that morning at 6 a.m. and he noticed that Travis was still wearing the same clothes he had on when he left the previous evening. Paul said that he did not see any signs of blood on these clothes or any other items of clothing that Travis owned, a statement which would be corroborated by the rest of his family. However, Dr. Peter Stevens, the forensic pathologist who did Cathy's autopsy, testified that even though she had been stabbed at least 54 times, the killer may not have necessarily gotten any blood on them, as none of the stab wounds penetrated any high-pressure vessels on her body, which would have caused blood to spurt on the perpetrator. The defense's biggest strategy was to attempt to discredit the DNA evidence against Travis and brought in some experts to testify that the testing methods provided by Cellmark Diagnostics were unreliable. At this point, Cellmark was performing an average of 600 DNA tests per year, and their labs had been used for such high-profile cases as the O.J. Simpson trial and the John Benet Ramsey murder. Their primary DNA testing method was known as a cocktail probe, which was widely used in Europe, but Cellmark was one of the only labs in the United States to use the cocktail probe, even though there were no validation or peer-reviewed studies for it. When Professor Patrick Connealy of the Indiana University Medical Center testified about cocktail probes, he stated, quote, "The advantage is that immediately they can see whether or not an evidentiary sample matches a sample from a suspect. If it doesn't, then they don't have to go further." End quote. Indeed, Dr. Randall Libby, a geneticist from Seattle, would also testify that even though the cocktail probe was an effective method for excluding suspects as being the source of DNA, it was scientifically unacceptable to use it to conclusively match a suspect to DNA evidence. Cellmark had stated that based on the results, the odds of anyone else besides Travis being the source of the DNA in the semen sample were 1 in a million. But Dr. Libby said that the odds should have been closer to 1 in 250,000, meaning that there were a number of other people out there with similar genetic characteristics who could have been the source of the DNA. This statement would be corroborated by Lawrence Mueller, a genetic and evolutionary biology professor at the University of California, who testified that Travis had 33 male relatives who were at least first cousins once removed. Using what he referred to as his own scientifically accepted formula, Mueller stated that the odds of any of these 33 relatives having a similar genetic profile to Travis were 1 in 84. A former Cellmark employee also testified that the semen sample the lab received contained Cathy's own DNA, some of which was degraded, but only a small amount of male DNA was detectable. Additional testimony was provided by a Cellmark molecular biologist who maintained that their testing methods were reliable, but acknowledged that even though a minimum of 50 nanograms of material is usually needed to get a good test result, there were only 25 nanograms of material in the male DNA found inside Cathy's body. Dr. Earl Rose, a professor of pathology at the University of Iowa, testified that a dozen sperm heads were found on Cathy's vaginal swab, which indicated that it had decomposed. Since sperm had to be intact in order to be identified, Dr. Rose wondered if perhaps this genetic material might have been confused with bacteria, fungus, or white blood cells. In other words, even though Cathy was found nude from the waist down, it was possible that she had not been sexually assaulted at all, rendering the so-called DNA evidence from the semen sample to be meaningless. On the advice of his attorneys, Travis never took the stand to testify on his own behalf at the trial. The case finally went to the jury, and on March the 21st, after deliberating for a total of 7 hours over the course of 2 days, they found Travis not guilty of first-degree murder. After serving 14 months in the Jones County Jail, Travis was finally released, and when asked what he wanted to do next, he replied, quote, "Go get drunk." Some of the jurors would tell the press that their main reasons for Travis's acquittal were that they were bothered by the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime, and they also thought the DNA evidence was faulty. Indeed, Dean Cox told the media that he believed the jury simply did not understand DNA analysis and felt that more public education would be required before it became an accepted form of evidence at criminal trials. The authorities announced that they had no plans to reopen the investigation into Cathy's murder because they still believed that Travis was the perpetrator, and due to double jeopardy, they would not be able to charge him and bring him to trial again. However, this would not be the end of the story because in July of that year, nearly 4 months after Travis's acquittal, Dean Cox filed a wrongful death lawsuit against him, asking for monetary and punitive damages which would be awarded to Cathy's son, Michael. Since Travis did not testify at his criminal trial, Dean felt that a civil trial might finally give him an opportunity to share his side of the story. But before this trial could take place, the Jamiesons would experience their own personal tragedy in October of 1997, when Travis's 22-year-old sister, Jennifer Jamieson, who had never stopped supporting him, wound up being killed in a car accident. Travis also found himself in additional legal trouble in 1998, when he was charged with the offenses of second-degree criminal mischief, operating a vehicle without the owner's consent, second offense drunk driving, and attempting to elude police. While he mostly received suspended sentences and probation for his offenses, Travis still had to serve 6 months at a correctional center in Cedar Rapids. After 2.5 years, the civil lawsuit against Travis finally made it to Jones County District Court in January of 2000. Since he had spent all his money on attorney's fees at his previous trial, Travis would function as his own counsel here. The plaintiff's case against Travis would pretty much be the same as the case against him at the first trial and feature testimony by many of the same witnesses. But this time, Travis did not cross-examine many of the experts who linked his DNA to Cathy's murder or call any witnesses on his behalf. Since this was a civil trial, the jury would consist of only 8 people rather than 12, and on January the 26th, after nearly 5 hours of deliberation, they reached the conclusion that Travis was responsible for Cathy's death and awarded $6 million in damage to her son Michael. Even though the Cox family did not expect to receive much, if any, money from Travis, they were still satisfied with the verdict, as Dean stated, quote, "I would say it was a definite message of homicide guilt and that this type of thing just isn't accepted in our society," end quote. Well, over 12 years later, in September of 2012, Travis wound up making the news again after an incident in which he was attacked at a bar in Monticello. Travis was stabbed in the neck with a utility knife by 26-year-old Joshua J. Meyer, who allegedly cried out that Travis would, quote-unquote, "not hurt anyone in my family again." Since Meyer had no known connection with Cathy or anyone from the Cox family, it's unclear what he meant by this statement, but he was hit with the felony charges of going armed with intent and willful injury. Travis wound up recovering from his injuries, but I was unable to find any information about how Meyer's legal situation ultimately turned out. Sadly, Cathy's mother, Karen Cox, passed away on October the 25th, 2020 at the age of 84, and in addition to her husband and her 4 surviving children, she left behind 6 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. As for Travis Jamieson, he also passed away on April the 17th, 2022 at the age of 44, after what his obituary described as a quote-unquote short illness. Per his wishes, no services were held, and Travis's body was cremated. There have been no further developments in the investigation since Travis's acquittal, so after 30 years, the full truth about who was actually responsible for the murder of Cathy Jo Bohlken remains up for debate. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I've covered my fair share of cases on this podcast which wound up going to trial, but the defendant was acquitted, which is why the trail went cold, so to speak. In many of these cases, law enforcement often held the attitude that there was nothing further they could do because they felt they got the right person all along, and since they could not take them to trial again, the investigation was essentially closed. I mean, yes, there are definitely situations where guilty people are acquitted and law enforcement's hands become tied, but it can be a frustrating situation if you feel that the defendant was innocent, and this attitude is essentially sending a message to the real perpetrator that they've gotten away with it. However, what separates this case from many of the other acquittals I've profiled is that DNA evidence actually seemed to implicate the defendant, yet the jury still found him not guilty. So you can understand why many people still believe to this day that Travis Jamieson was responsible for the murder of Cathy Jo Bohlken. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the phenomenon known as the CSI effect, which was named after the popular TV show CSI Crime Scene Investigation. The fictional crimes showcased on CSI and its numerous spin-off shows are often solved when forensic science conclusively links physical evidence to the perpetrator, but of course, these stories are heavily dramatized and real-life forensic investigations are usually not that simple. Over the past 2 decades, we've heard complaints from law enforcement officers and prosecutors that shows like CSI have unreasonably raised the standard of proof at criminal trials and given some jurors the mindset that you always need clear-cut forensic evidence to prove someone's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt and convict them. Well, depending on how you look at it, Travis Jamieson's trial could almost be considered an example of the reverse CSI effect. I think Cathy's father, Dean Cox, said it best following Travis's acquittal, when he expressed his opinion that more public education was needed about DNA analysis. We have this period between the early to mid-1990s and the launch of CSI in the early 2000s, when there were quite a few cases in which defendants were tried for murder and found not guilty, even though DNA evidence linked them to the crime. And this was likely the result of the general public just not having a clear understanding of how DNA worked. Obviously, the first high-profile case which put DNA profiling into the spotlight was when O.J. Simpson went on trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Much like Travis Jamieson's trial, Cellmark Diagnostics performed DNA analysis on the evidence, and the director of laboratories would provide testimony about the results. He said that when some blood found at the crime scene was tested, it had genetic markers which showed there was a 1 in 170 million chance that it could have belonged to anyone else but O.J. Simpson. Even more damning was when blood on O.J.'s sock was tested, and the results showed that the odds of it belonging to anyone else besides Nicole were 1 in 6.8 billion, which was larger than the Earth's entire population. However, since DNA was still a fairly new tool in criminal investigations at that time, the prosecution was concerned that spending too much time focusing on it would only confuse the jury, and as I'm sure you're well aware, this DNA evidence was not enough for them to find O.J. guilty. Of course, there were other mitigating factors which led to O.J. being acquitted, but here's an example of a lesser-known case in which a similar situation took place. It was once featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and I also covered it for an exclusive bonus episode I released on Patreon last year, but the victim was named Eileen Mangold, and she was abducted in the middle of her shift at a gas station in Riverview, Florida in September of 1989, before she was raped and murdered. DNA testing on some semen found on Eileen's blouse eventually linked the crime to a suspect named Franklin Alfred Smith, and the analysis showed that the odds of this DNA belonging to anyone else besides him were 1 in 57 trillion. But guess what? When Smith went on trial for the murder in 2000, his first trial ended in a hung jury that was deadlocked at 6-6, and the second one ended with a not guilty verdict. Smith's defense team did a really effective job at pushing forward the idea that the DNA had been improperly handled or stored, which caused contamination to take place, and both juries even stated that they had issues with the reliability of the DNA evidence. As a result, an obvious murderer wound up going free, though I'm sure things probably would have turned out differently if Smith had gone on trial with his evidence today. DNA evidence has since become a much bigger part of the public consciousness, so I also think there's a good chance that Travis Jamieson would be convicted if his trial took place now. In the trials of O.J. Simpson and Franklin Alfred Smith, we saw DNA evidence with odds in the hundreds of millions, billions, and trillions, and DNA testing has advanced so much that these days, it's not uncommon to see results where the odds are in the quadrillions. By comparison, the results of the DNA analysis in this case showed that the odds of the semen sample belonging to anyone else but Travis Jamieson were 1 in a million, and one defense expert testified that he believed the odds should have been closer to 1 in 250,000. So let's just say that there were around 100 million white males living in the United States in 1993. With the 1 in a million odds, that means there could have been about 100 other white males with the same genetic markers in their DNA, and with the 1 in 250,000 odds, then the number of potential matches rises to 400. I mean, yes, the chances of this crime being committed by a completely different individual with the same genetic markers as Travis are not high, But that's assuming that the DNA testing was conducted properly to begin with and the results were not contaminated. I want to go back and make reference to another case which was featured on this podcast in episode number 211, and that's the 1995 murder of University of Nebraska-Lincoln student Tina McMenamin. Once again, Cellmark Diagnostics got involved and performed DNA testing on a follicle of hair which was found in Tina's hands, and they used a process called DQ alpha testing. The testing wound up linking the hair to a suspect named Gregory Gable, and the results showed that the odds of it belonging to anyone else besides him were 1 in 1,049, which was hardly conclusive, since that meant between 90,000 and 100,000 other white males living in the US at that time could have been a match. Even though Gable was charged with the murder, some mitochondrial DNA analysis was performed on the hair before he went to trial, and this time the results excluded him. And since there was virtually no other evidence against Gable besides the initial DNA match, the state was no longer confident that they could secure a conviction, so they dropped the murder charges and let Gable go. Unfortunately, since the new DNA analysis completely used up the hair follicle, no further testing can be performed to attempt to link it to another suspect. The same thing essentially happened in this case, as the semen sample from Cathy's murder was so small that the original DNA testing completely consumed it, so Travis's defense team never got the opportunity to perform their own testing. If the semen sample was still available today, I'm sure more advanced testing could be performed on it to determine beyond a shadow of a doubt whether or not it belonged to Travis. As the situation with Gregory Gable demonstrates, even if you get a DNA match to a suspect, it's important to have additional corroborating evidence against them in case the DNA evidence isn't reliable, and the same logic applies in this case. Yes, Travis had a rather shaky alibi, drove past the murder scene on the night of the crime, was personally acquainted with the victim, had a potential motive, and made a couple of odd, possibly incriminating statements. But other than the DNA, there was no real evidence actually placing him at the murder scene. During Travis's trial, his defense attorneys used what I believe to be some very calculated wording when they said that no quote-unquote physical evidence linked him to the crime. Yes, it is true that there was no blood, fingerprints, hairs, fibers, or footprints placing him there, but the prosecution had to remind the jury that yes, DNA also counts as physical evidence. However, I don't think that made much of an impression, as the jurors admitted that they felt the DNA evidence was faulty and were bothered by the lack of additional evidence implicating Travis, which is why they found him not guilty. I mean, it would be one thing if Tina's killer was a career criminal or a violent offender, but Travis was a kid who was only 16 years old when the murder took place. Yes, it does not sound like Travis was a choir boy, as he was a high school dropout and had a few brushes with the law, which included arrests for drunk driving, but I haven't heard about him having any real history of violence. I think the jury just had a hard time imagining that this average-sized 16-year-old could stab an older woman around 54 times, duct tape her hands, and place a bag over her head and sexually assault her without leaving more evidence behind. Now, since Travis's trial took place just over a year after the conclusion of the O.J. Simpson trial, a number of contemporary news articles made comparisons between them, but another parallel between the two cases is that even though the defendant was acquitted, the victim's family decided to file a wrongful death lawsuit against them and came out victorious at the civil trial. In fact, Dean Cox even stated that he was inspired by the results of the lawsuit filed against O.J. by Ron Goldman's family, as they actually wound up winning the civil trial and were awarded over $33 million in damages only 1 month before Travis's murder trial began. While Travis wound up being found liable for Cathy's wrongful death, it should be noted that the burden of proof at a civil trial is much lower than at a criminal trial, and since Travis could not afford his own attorney and had to represent himself, it was probably inevitable that he wound up losing. However, if Travis Jamieson was truly guilty of this crime, then you could say that karma ultimately got him in the end, as not only did he lose the civil trial, but he wound up passing away last year at the young age of 44. But if Travis was not actually responsible for Cathy's murder, then who was? At the outset, it does not sound like Travis was high on the list of suspects, as the crime remained unsolved for over 2 years, and law enforcement took blood samples from around 90 men for DNA testing before they finally got a match. I know that in the early stages of the investigation, they took blood samples from 3 men whom they considered to be the most promising suspects, but the DNA testing wound up clearing them. The names of these 3 individuals were never released publicly, but I have to assume that they looked at Cathy's ex-husband, Michael Bohlken Sr. Even though the divorce had been an amicable one, and their joint custody arrangement with Michael Jr. seemed to be going well, I can understand why they would need to look at Michael Sr., but at no point have I ever seen any indication that he was considered to be a serious suspect. As time went on, law enforcement started obtaining DNA from anyone who even had a loose connection to Cathy, and since Travis's blood sample was not collected until July of 1995, a year and a half after the crime, I get the impression that no one thought he was a serious candidate to be the killer. You might be asking why Travis would willingly submit a blood sample to law enforcement if he was guilty, but considering that the general public did not have a strong understanding of DNA profiling back in 1995, it's reasonable to assume that Travis did not either, and may not have realized how much this could implicate him. Now, if you do some digging online, you'll find some comments which have been left by people from the Monticello area who have named potential alternate suspects besides Travis. But since I've never seen any of these people get publicly mentioned by law enforcement during the investigation, and their alleged involvement sounds like nothing more than rumors and gossip, I'm not going to repeat their names here. I've even seen rumors of a cover-up taking place because a police officer killed Cathy and Travis became the fall guy, and I'm sure this gossip was fueled by the fact that Monticello Police Chief Burt Walters was dismissed from his position only days before Travis's arrest. But the authorities did confirm that Walters' removal was completely unrelated to this case, and the timing was nothing more than a coincidence. Since no one has really been pushed forward as a viable alternate suspect, there's not much else I can say about this matter, so I'm going to focus mainly on the case which was made against Travis. Now, I'm obviously no DNA expert, so I can't say with any certainty whether or not the testing methods which link Travis to the crime are reliable. But it's worth noting that some of the so-called experts who were brought in by the defense to discredit the methods used by Cellmark Diagnostics and generate reasonable doubt have been the source of controversy. One of these men was Professor Lawrence Mueller from the University of California, who provided testimony at a number of trials like this. I found a Los Angeles Times article from November of 1992 titled "The DNA Wars," which discussed the use of experts to testify in criminal trials involving DNA evidence, and it described Mueller as a quote-unquote favorite whipping boy in the DNA debate. Mueller usually testified on behalf of the defense and made a good living being paid to do so, but he was accused of making deliberately false statements and lying about statistics during his testimony, and was branded a quote-unquote hired gun devoid of principles. Let's not forget that it was Mueller who mentioned that Travis had 33 male relatives and said that the odds of one of them having a similar genetic profile to Travis were 1 in 84. Mueller said that he used his own scientifically proven formula to reach those numbers, but I have no idea if there's any validity to them at all, or if Mueller just pulled them out of thin air, but they obviously made an impression on the jury. Like Mueller, Dr. Randall Libby testified on behalf of the defense and attempted to discredit the DNA results, but he has also been criticized for his willingness to do this for any criminal defendant for the right price. In 2016, Libby was called upon to testify as a DNA expert at the trial of Travis Vader, who had been charged with murdering an elderly couple named Lyle and Marie McCann in Alberta 6 years earlier. Libby attempted to discredit the DNA evidence against Vader by attacking its sampling, processing, and analysis, but it didn't do much good, since Vader was found guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. Following the verdict, the trial judge openly criticized Libby's analysis, once again referring to him as a quote-unquote hired gun who was brought in to actively mislead the court. So in a sense, Mueller and Libby did exactly what they were paid to do when they were brought in to testify at Travis Jamieson's trial, and back in 1997, when the general public had less of an understanding of DNA analysis, I can see why the jury would have put some credence into what these experts said. But in order to objectively determine if Travis really did kill Cathy, let's put aside the DNA evidence for the moment and look at the full facts of the case. We know that the last time Cathy was confirmed to be alive was at around 10 p.m. or so on Christmas night, when she spoke on the phone to her roommate, Renee Ballou, who was attending a party and wound up spending the night there. Renee's absence is a very important detail because you have to wonder if Cathy's killer would have known she was going to be alone that night. During the early stages of the investigation, there was speculation that someone from this party could have overheard Renee's phone conversation and decided to take advantage of the situation by heading over to Cathy's apartment, but it doesn't look like this angle went anywhere. What we do know is that Travis had been attending another party that night and drove Cathy's brother Mike home and dropped him off at 10:15 p.m. And even though Travis claimed he did not have a recollection of this because he was drunk, Mike said they drove past Cathy's apartment on the way home. So theoretically, after parting ways with Mike, Travis could have driven back to the apartment and killed Cathy. It was established that Travis had been to the apartment on previous occasions, and there was an incident where he allegedly grabbed a pair of Cathy's underwear and rubbed them against his crotch. Travis had made remarks in the past about wanting to have sex with Cathy, though he was apparently not the only friend of Mike's who said such a thing, as they all believed she was a very attractive woman. When Dean Cox showed up at Cathy's apartment on the morning of December the 26th, he said that the front door was ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry. This means that either Cathy did not lock the door the previous evening and the killer just walked into the apartment, or the perpetrator showed up there and Cathy let them inside, suggesting that she might have been murdered by someone she knew. Since Travis was a friend of her brother's and only 16 years old, Cathy may have felt comfortable enough to let him inside if he knocked on the front door, even if it was late at night. Travis definitely had a potential motive to sexually assault and murder Cathy, but it's never been conclusively established if he knew Renee would not be at the apartment that night. If Renee drove her own vehicle and Travis noticed it was not parked in front of the apartment while he was driving Mike home, that could have given him motivation to head back there. Or if Travis stopped by and knocked on the door and Cathy told him Renee was gone, this is also how he could have found out. Now, there was definitely some contradictory information about whether or not Travis had an alibi during the time period Cathy was killed. He always maintained that after dropping Mike off, he returned to the party, passed out on the couch at around 1 a.m. before he woke up and returned home at 6 o'clock. It sounds like different attendees at the party had different recollections of Travis being there during the early morning hours of the 26th, which is not surprising, considering that a lot of drinking took place there and people's memories are going to be hazy. Travis's cousin, Brent Klassen, who hosted the party, seems certain that he saw Travis sleeping on the couch when he went to bed at 1:30. But even if he is telling the truth, I wouldn't necessarily say that this clears Travis. Unless there was someone watching over Travis the entire night, who's to say that he couldn't have woken up sometime after 1:30 and traveled to Cathy's apartment to kill her before he returned home? Of course, if Travis went to the apartment and murdered Cathy right after he dropped Mike off at 10:15, then it seems pretty brazen that he would go back to the party and somehow manage not to give off any warning signs that he had committed such a horrible crime. Travis's father testified that when he returned home at 6 a.m., Travis was still wearing the same clothes he wore when he left the previous evening and did not have any noticeable signs of blood on him, even though he had supposedly just stabbed someone around 54 times. But while I don't want to flat out accuse anyone of lying, this was Travis's father, so who knows what his family may have been willing to say to protect him. At the time Travis returned home, Cathy's body had not yet been discovered, so in his family's eyes, this probably seemed like nothing more than an ordinary, routine morning, and certain warning signs may have been missed. Since Travis was not charged with murder until 2 years after the fact, you do have to wonder if they would have had such an accurate recollection of the clothing he was wearing after so much time had passed. We know that Travis got intoxicated at the party, which might seem like a convenient excuse for why he gave some inconsistent statements about his whereabouts that night, and it could also mean that his inhibitions went down, which is why he felt brazen enough to visit Cathy's apartment. Perhaps he didn't originally plan on killing her and only wanted to have sex, but when she resisted him, things escalated into violence. But on the other side of the coin, if Travis was drunk, it is surprising that he could commit a crime like that without leaving more physical evidence behind besides semen containing his DNA. The fact of the matter is that there were no fingerprints, hairs, or fibers linking him to the murder scene, and it's hard to imagine a 16-year-old having the wherewithal to clean up all that evidence. Dean Cox said that he saw footprints in the snow leading towards the front door when he showed up the following morning, but if those footprints were preserved, it doesn't sound like they were matched to Travis. The murder weapon was never found, and while we know Travis was driving his parents' pickup truck that night, there were no eyewitness reports of the truck being seen parked at Cathy's apartment. There's also the fact that Cathy was bound with duct tape and had a plastic bag over her head, so it resembles the sort of crime you'd expect to find from a serial killer who has done this before, not a 16-year-old high school dropout. It's also never been made clear to me if the duct tape and the bag originated from the apartment, and I haven't read anything about a knife being missing from there. So it's possible that the killer may have brought all these items with them, which indicates premeditation. Obviously, 16-year-olds are capable of committing murders like this, but Travis was either very skilled at getting rid of the evidence, or he just got very lucky that he avoided leaving more evidence behind. But the one important point which was reiterated numerous times throughout the investigation and the trial is that there was no logical way to account for Travis's semen being present in Cathy's body. Before Travis was charged with the crime, he was asked if he ever had sex with Cathy and said no. And even after he went to trial, Travis never did change his story and pushed forward the consensual sex scenario to explain the presence of his semen, which is something many criminal defendants have done after they've been implicated by DNA evidence. And no, I do not believe this small-town police department would have had the foresight to plant Travis's DNA at the scene in order to frame him. The only way Travis's defense attorneys could counter this was by attacking the credibility of the DNA testing and alleging that the match between the semen sample and Travis's DNA was a mistake. And to their credit, their strategy did work, as the jury only had to deliberate for a total of 7 hours over the course of 2 days before they reached their not guilty verdict. I do think the prosecution made the mistake of relying too heavily on the DNA and really should have produced additional corroborating evidence, though it's possible that this evidence simply didn't exist. Yet some of Travis's cryptic remarks, such as when he asked Mike how he would react if the DNA results came back and they matched, were pretty odd and could be construed as a sign of guilt. But I think the jury just needed something else which placed Travis at the murder scene. Like I've already reiterated numerous times, if this trial took place in 2023, the DNA evidence may have been enough for a conviction, but back in 1997, juries needed more to counteract the testimony which attacked the credibility of the testing. Overall, even though I am still a bit bothered by the lack of additional physical evidence implicating Travis, I can't overlook the presence of his DNA in the semen sample, as I think a catastrophic mistake would have needed to occur for him to be falsely implicated. I do think the scenario of Travis feeling this compulsion to attack Cathy while she was alone inside her apartment does make sense. The original investigation pretty much looked into everyone from Cathy's personal life and could find no one else who seemed like a solid suspect, so the only other alternate explanation is that Cathy was killed by a complete stranger who may not have even lived in Monticello and was just passing through the area. I could possibly get behind this theory a lot more if there was evidence of forced entry or a break-in by an intruder, but the way the scene was left, it appears that Cathy may have known her killer and willingly let them inside. And while I don't think Cathy had a particularly close relationship with Travis, she may have felt comfortable opening the door late at night for a friend of her brother's. Since Travis has since passed away and never admitted any culpability in the murder, we may never really know the full truth about what happened, but if he was guilty all along, then I suppose justice was ultimately served. I know that it's common practice for missing and murdered victims to be painted in the best possible light by their friends and relatives, but in all the media coverage I've seen of this case, everyone who knew Cathy had nothing but glowing things to say about her and claimed she was one of the kindest, sweetest people you'd ever want to meet. It's crazy to think that her son Michael Jr., who was still a toddler when she was killed, would now be in his early 30s, and it's very sad that he's been forced to grow up without his mother. Even if Travis was the real killer, and there is no mystery here per se, It's very important for podcast episodes such as this to keep the memories of victims like Cathy alive to ensure they are never forgotten. All that being said, if you happen to have any information to indicate that someone else besides Travis Jamieson was responsible for the murder of Cathy Jo Bohlken, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 5 years, our Patreon page has released dozens of exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released an episode about the disappearances of 2 men named Mel Wilson and Richard Lepsey, as the respective families have explored the possibility that one of these men may have become the infamous unidentified hijacker known only as D.B. Cooper. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my 2 co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss the 1990 disappearance of 3 men who vanished after the sinking of a fishing boat called the Casey Nicole. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 50 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Olive and Moonshiner. Thank you so much for your support. Also, I'm excited to announce that The Trail Went Cold has once again officially been booked to appear on Podcast Row at CrimeCon UK next year, which is taking place in London on September the 21st and 22nd of 2024. If you would like to purchase tickets to the events, please visit their website, crimecon.co.uk, and use our specialized promo code COLD24 to get a 10% discount on tickets. Once again, that's crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COLD24 for 10% off tickets. Hope to see you there. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week, and join us again next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.